Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a really deep, emotional dive into history. We're looking at a moment where, honestly, immense joy and unimaginable loss just collided, literally on the exact same day, August 15, 1947. After basically 2 centuries of British rule, India finally achieved independence. People were celebrating in the streets. But at the exact same time, there was this whole other story unfolding, a massive story of fear, forced migration, violence, and the literal tearing apart of British India into 2 brand new nations, India and Pakistan. Let's try to put ourselves right in the middle of it. Picture this. You wake up one morning in August 1947. Your house is exactly where you left it, your fields are right outside, your neighbors are still next door. But suddenly, overnight, your whole world has shifted. The ground you're standing on is now on the other side of a newly drawn international border. Millions of people literally woke up to find themselves in a country they felt they could no longer safely stay in. So you really have to ask yourself, how did we get here? How did a society where Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and so many other communities had lived side by side for centuries, how did they reach this profound, violent fracture? Well, to understand how the map of South Asia was basically rewritten overnight, we can't just look at 1947. We've got to rewind the clock quite a bit. Part 1. Seeds of Political Division. It's actually fascinating when you trace this back. You start to see how escalating British control sparked some very early political pushback. Take 1857, for example. You had Indian soldiers and civilians, Hindus and Muslims, fighting right alongside each other, rising up against the East India Company. It didn't succeed, but it shook the British so badly that by 1858, the British Crown took direct control over the whole operation. But the really critical turning point here is 1905, the Partition of Bengal. The British claimed Bengal was just, too big to govern properly, so they split it into a Muslim-majority East and a Hindu-majority West. But Indian nationalists, they saw right through it. They saw a deliberate attempt to fracture the growing nationalist movement by splitting political interests along religious lines. The protests were absolutely massive. And even though they reversed the decision in 1911, the damage was completely done. Political identity was now being talked about in terms of religious community. And sure enough, just a year later in 1906, the All India Muslim League was founded specifically to protect Muslim political interests. And then we hit this absolutely crucial moment, the Morley-Minto reforms in 1909. These introduced something called separate electorates. So, what did this actually mean in practice? Basically, it meant Muslim voters could elect their own representatives from specifically designated Muslim constituencies. Supporters argued it was a necessary safeguard for a minority community. Critics, on the other hand, were terrified it would permanently cement religious divisions. But the huge takeaway here is this. Whatever the original intent was, religious identity was now officially baked right into the electoral system. And, as history usually shows us, once you formally tie political competition to religious identity, making political compromises down the road becomes, well, almost impossible. Part 2. Fracturing the subcontinent. Now, it's important to remember it wasn't just a straight downward spiral to division. In 1916, we actually had the Lucknow Pact. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who, of course, later founded Pakistan, was a huge driver here, bringing the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League together to strongly support Hindu-Muslim unity. And going into the early 1920s, Mahatma Gandhi was leading these mass movements, like the Caliphate and non-cooperation movements, bringing huge numbers of Hindus and Muslims together to resist British rule. There was this incredible sense of early optimism. But it just didn't hold. The movements eventually collapsed, communal tensions flared right back up, and riots broke out. That fragile political trust they had briefly built up, it slowly, devastatingly unraveled. Moving into the late 20s and 30s, the gap between the sides just completely blew wide open. It's basically this rapid-fire sequence of proposals and counterproposals that just kept missing each other. In 1928, you had the Nehru Report, which left a lot of Muslim League leaders pretty dissatisfied. That prompted Jinnah to put forward his famous 14 points in 1929. By 1930, philosopher Muhammad Iqbal is out there proposing a fully consolidated Muslim-majority political unit. And then we hit 1937. The British had expanded provincial self-government, and in those elections, the Indian National Congress won big. The Muslim League, on the other hand, really struggled, even in Muslim-majority provinces. This was a massive, massive wake-up call for Jinnah. He instantly realized the League desperately needed to become a mass political organization, pushing a very clear new message. Indian Muslims needed a separate political future. Which brings us to the actual ideological core of this whole conflict. The Muslim League really started pushing what became known as the two-nation theory. Basically, this was the idea that Hindus and Muslims weren't just two religious groups living in the same space. They were fundamentally separate political nations with completely different histories and cultural identities. The Indian National Congress flat out rejected that. Their stance was that India was one single united nation made up of many different religions, languages, and cultures. So we're not just talking about a minor policy dispute here. Actually, scratch that, it was a complete foundational clash over what the future of the entire subcontinent should look like.
Part 3. The Road to Partition.
By the 1940s, events are just cascading, making partition feel almost inevitable. In 1940, the Muslim League adopts the Lahore Resolution, officially calling for independent political units in Muslim-majority areas. That right there laid the groundwork for the Pakistan movement. And then World War II completely changes the game. Britain is desperate for India's support, but Indian leaders are demanding outright independence. You have British negotiations, like the 1942 Cripps mission, completely falling apart, which triggers massive protests, like the Quit India movement. By the time the war ends, Britain is economically drained. They are completely exhausted and ready to pack up. But the big question was, what exactly are they leaving behind? A united India or a divided one? With negotiations constantly failing, the communal violence gets horrific, especially after the 1946 Direct Action Day in Calcutta. Things get so dangerous that the British leadership, along with the last viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, basically decide that a rapid transfer of power and partition was the only viable way out. And so, all of that political wrangling finally comes to a head right here. August 14th, 1947, Pakistan gains its independence. And the very next day, August 15th, India becomes independent. The British colonial flags came down for the last time, the new flags went up, and after generations of struggle, two brand new sovereign nations officially stepped onto the world stage.
Part 4. The Human Cost.
Okay, I really want to pause here for a second. 15 million people. You just kind of have to let that number sink in. Because if there's one thing you take away from this explainer, it has to be the sheer absolute scale of what happened next. This wasn't just some neat and tidy political transition on paper. It was an absolute human catastrophe. To this day, it remains one of the largest forced migrations in modern history.
We really need to anchor that massive statistic in the actual, painful reality of what people were going through. Hindus and Sikhs were desperately moving toward India, while millions of Muslims were moving the opposite way toward Pakistan. Families were frantically packing literally whatever they could carry in their own hands. They were leaving behind their businesses, their schools, ancestral lands they would never ever see again. And the journeys? Incredibly dangerous. People traveled by train, by cart, and trucks, or just walked for miles and miles on foot. Communities that have lived together for generations were ripped apart literally overnight, and the violence was horrific. Sometimes refugee trains would pull into stations filled with people who hadn't even survived the trip. The death toll estimates vary from several 100,000 to over 1 million lives lost. And behind every single one of those numbers was a mother desperately searching for her child, or a lifelong neighbor who had tragically become a stranger.
But, amidst all that darkness, we have to remember the full spectrum of humanity that was on display, because right alongside the unspeakable tragedy, there were these incredible, profound stories of courage. Ordinary people standing up, protecting their neighbors from angry mobs, actively helping refugees escape safely across the new borders, literally risking their own lives to save people of completely different faiths. So while partition is absolutely a story of violence and bitter division, for sure, it is also this really powerful testament to human compassion, survival, and just sheer resilience.
Now here we are over 7 decades later, and those borders drawn in the 1940s, they are still heavily dictating the reality of South Asia today. We have independent India and Pakistan, and of course, the massive 1971 transformation that created Bangladesh out of East Pakistan. Those lines on the map continue to influence everything from regional geopolitics to military tensions. But honestly, the most profound legacy isn't geopolitical at all. It's personal. It's the generational memories carried by millions of families around the world today, stories of lost homes, of separation, and the incredible strength of people who basically had to rebuild their entire lives from absolute scratch. I want to leave you with this really powerful thought from our source material today. Quote, "Partition is not just the history of borders and politicians. It is the history of people who lost homes, crossed borders, survived, and carried the memories." The political lines might have been drawn on a map, but the true impact was carved right into the lives of millions of ordinary people. So I leave you with this to think about. How long does it actually take for a heavily drawn border to erase a shared history? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.